Last time we spoke about the end of World War I and China's bitter experience at the Paris Peace Conference. Yes, World War I brought a lot of drama to China. Yuan Shikai and later prominent figures like Duxiu took the poor habit of making secret deals with the Japanese that would very much bite them in the ass later on in Paris. The Chinese delegation came to Paris hoping to secure major demands, most notably to solve the ongoing Shandong problem. Instead, they quite literally found out there were secret deals between China and Japan that completely hindered their war aims. To add insult to injury, the Western powers, notably Britain, had also made secret double dealings with Japan. In the end, Japan got her way. China did not. It was so embarrassing, the Chinese delegation did not even bother signing the Treaty of Versailles. Things could not possibly get any worse, could they? This episode is The New Culture Movement. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I've just released part 3 in my series on the invasion of Manchuria, Operation Jinzhou. This series is an in-depth account of Japan's conquest of Manchuria and the formation of the puppet state Manchukuo. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you can find exclusive podcasts. There is an ongoing poll right now for the next one, and it looks like the subject matter might be about the century of humiliation and how it helped form the People's Republic of China we see today. So rush on over and check it out. What we're about to talk about is actually part of a much larger event in modern Chinese history. I have to acknowledge, over on my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, I had made an episode on this topic. I had no idea at the time what I was getting myself into, but I'm very glad I tackled it. It was the first time a large portion of Chinese audience members came forward and thanked me for covering the subject. And to this, I was honestly quite a bit baffled. The episode picked up steam, and I thought, why is this getting so many views? From my point of view, it seemed like a rather boring subject. It's not involving a battle, it's more of a political episode. Well, it would turn out, case in point, this story is kind of really the birth of modern-day China. If you go searching for books on this subject, you will find so many on its impact on just about every facet of China today, and even upon other nations like India. Stating all of that, there's actually 2 major subjects at play here, and they kind of overlap each other. The very large subject I was talking about is the May 4th movement. Yet underneath that is something else called the New Culture Movement. I'm going to do my very best to try and cohesively tell this one, but it's a rather difficult one to tell. That's why I decided to not just lump them all together in one episode or into a series of episodes, so for the sake of cohesion, I'm actually separating them. Thus, I'm first going to tackle the New Culture Movement on this episode, and then the next episode will be on the May 4th movement. Even stating that, this isn't kind of like a chronologically cohesive episode in any way. It really involves hundreds of different figures, all with different thought processes that lead to, well, the major event in the end. Overall, it has been described as kind of China's Renaissance, and honestly, I think that's pretty well fitting. The New Culture Movement, or New Cultural Movement, is intertwined with the May 4th movement, or you can call it the progenitor. In essence, it was the progressivist movement that sprang up in the 1910s and would continue through the 1920s, criticizing traditional Chinese ideology and promoting a new culture. This new culture was influenced by New Age science and modern ideals. It's during this period you find many of China's big scholars starting to speak out and making names for themselves. Now, we have been talking in some length about numerous issues that hit China during the 1910s, such as World War I, Yuan Shikai's craziness, secret dealings, getting leaked to the public, the Shandong problem, the Treaty of Versailles, and all of these summed up were just more and more humiliation for China. The people of China were fed up. The people of China wanted change. Now, it's hard to encompass all that was sought out, but there are 6 large themes of the new culture movement that I shall list. The first change the public wanted was because of their outdated writing system. They wanted a more vernacular one. Secondly was the Confucian-based traditional patriarchal family model. It was very outdated, and it was quite a hindrance against individual freedoms and women's rights. Thirdly, the people wanted China to be a real nation, one amongst the other nations of the world, not stuck in the old Confucian model. Fourth, the people wanted China to adopt a more scientific approach to things rather than the traditional Confucian belief system. Fifth, the Chinese people wanted democracy, human rights, all the enlightened values other nations seem to have. And lastly, China had always been a nation who typically looked at the past rather than towards the future. This had to end. Now, before we hit each of these, let's summarize a bit of the time period, the environment, and the feeling of the day. The Qing dynasty had fallen during the Xinhai Revolution, seeing the rise of Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai stamped down upon all opposition. This included intellectuals also. Many were thrown into exile. There was, of course, a lot of animosity towards Yuan Shikai. He was, after all, the guy, for lack of better words, who stole leadership from Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and he crushed the Second Revolution. One of these intellectual exiles found himself in Tokyo, Zhang Xijiao. There he founded a political magazine called The Tiger. The Tiger ran for about a year in 1915 and would have a significant impact on other political journals that would emerge in China. The Tiger was known for probing political questions of the day. Its writers often grappled with how underlying cultural values and beliefs shaped politics. It inspired others to write similar magazines, notably Chen Duxiu. Now, also in 1915, as we know, the 21 demands were issued. Yuan Shikai was forced to sign the 13 demands in the end, and all of this got leaked to the public. In 1915, Chen Duxiu founded the magazine Jiangao, Qingyan, New Youth, and he would have future intellectuals as editors of it, such as Li Dajiao, He Shihe, and Lu Xun. In its first issue titled Jiangao Qingyan, literally translated as Letter to the Youth, it encouraged young people to, quote, "Be independent and not enslaved. Be progressive and not conservative. Be in the forefront and not lagging behind. Be internationalist and not isolationist. Be practical and not rhetorical. And be scientific and not superstitious." Chen Duxiu advocated for science and democracy. These would become rallying cries, often in the form of, quote, Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science. This would spring forth more literature like Xinqiao, the Renaissance, founded by the Renaissance Society in 1918, whose members included Beijing students directly inspired by Chen Duxiu, He Shihe, and Li Dajiao. The Renaissance Society promoted Western political and social ideology, encouraging the youth of China to embrace progressive politics. The New Youth was by far the most influential magazine. In 1917, Chen Duxiu and Zhang Xijiao moved to Beijing University, where they became acquaintances and alongside others built up a community that would usher in the new culture movement. At this time, the intellectual powerhouses were at Peking University and Tsinghua University in Beijing and in Shanghai, which had a booming publishing industry. Many scholars who would contribute to the new culture movement would be found at Peking University, such as Cai Yuanpei, who served as president of the university in 1916. Cai Yuanpei was a colleague of our old friend Li Xizeng, who both founded the diligent work, frugal study movement, sending workers to study in France. It was Tai Yunpai who recruited those like Chen Duxiu, Li Dajiao, and Hu Shihe. Chen Duxiu served as the dean of the School of Arts and Letters at the university. Li Dajiao became its librarian, and Hu Shihe helped translate and perform numerous letters. These men would lead the fight for Baihua Wenxue, or the vernacular literature movement. Yes, there's a lot of movements in this episode. Now, Baihua is a form of written Chinese based on the numerous varieties of Chinese spoken in the country versus what we call classical Chinese. This probably sounds a bit confusing to you Westerners, but think of it this way. Going all the way back to the Shang Dynasty, a process of creating Chinese characters was gradually standardized by the time of the Qin Dynasty. So that's 1200 BC to about 206 BC. Over the following dynasties, the Chinese calligraphy is created. However, what also occurs is, of course, the evolution of language. The Chinese language branched off into numerous dialects. Thus, all over China, people are speaking different but related forms of Chinese. Yet the way that they write is using this old classical Chinese writing style. As you might imagine, by the time of the 20th century, the classical Chinese writing is so vastly different from what people are actually speaking, such as modern Mandarin, Cantonese, Hokkien, and many other languages. Classical Chinese has become extremely outdated. Chinese intellectuals in the early 20th century were looking to reform the literary system. Two of the big proposals that came about were to simplify Chinese characters and create a Chinese writing system using the Latin alphabet. Professor at Peking University, Chen Qiantong, was the leading figure of the Latinization movement. Chen Duxiu, on the topic of Chinese characters, had said, quote, "Backwards, difficult to recognize, and inconvenient to write." He blamed them for China being stuck in conservatism and having lacked modernization. There was a very real movement to switch to pinyin to spell out Chinese characters. For those who don't know, pinyin is alphabetically written Chinese, aka the only way Craig is able to read most of his sources for this podcast series. So a big thanks to the Chinese community who came up with pinyin. But the plan to formalize this never really occurred. There was no real fight for it. Many scholars began writing in Baihua. One of the most famous works was Lu Xun's A Madman's Diary. In essence, it was a short story criticizing early 20th century Chinese society, trying to challenge its audience into conventional thinking versus traditional understanding. The story has Lu Xun's madman seeing family and village members around him performing cannibalism, which he has attributed to some Confucian classics. Basically, he implies China's traditional culture was mentally cannibalistic. Building somewhat on the theme, Chen Duxiu wrote in The New Youth how Mr. Confucius needed to be replaced by Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. Meanwhile, Hu Shihe argued, "A dead language cannot produce a living literature." He further argued a new written format would allow the Chinese people with less education to read texts, articles, books, and so forth. It was classical Chinese that was holding the less educated back. Basically, he was criticizing how scholars held something of a monopoly on information. Hu Shihe was highly praised for his efforts. One man named Mao Zedong would have a lot to say about how grateful China should be to him. Mao Zedong, of course, was an assistant at Peking University's library at this time. Now, alongside the battle to change the written language of China, there was also a feminist movement as well. Women suffered greatly under the traditional system. Prior to the 20th century, women in China were considered essentially different from men, as you can imagine. Confucius argued that an ordered and morally correct society would refrain from the use of force. Violence and coercion were deviant and unwelcomed. Instead, a correct person would aim to become jinci, meaning gentleman or a person of integrity. For society to remain stable, it was crucial correct hierarchies were established. Servants obey masters, subjects obey rulers, children obey their parents, and women obey men. There was, of course, the association of women with yin and men with yang, two qualities considered important by Taoism. Still, had women occupying a lower position than men in the hierarchical order. The I Ching stated, "Great righteousness is shown in that man and woman occupy their correct places, the relative positions of heaven and earth." Women, of course, were supposed to be submissive and obedient to men, normally forbidden to participate in things like politics, the military, or communal aspects of China. The traditional Confucian culture led Chinese society simply to value men over women. Now, to get into the more hardcore aspects of this, did you know China had a near 2,000-year history of female infanticide? It was written by many Christian missionaries arriving in the late 16th century to China that they had witnessed newborns being thrown into rivers or in the rubbish quite often. Now, the primary cause of this practice was poverty and shortages of food. Confucianism influenced this practice quite a bit. Male children were to work, provide and care for their elders, while females were to be married off as quickly as possible. During the 19th century, ninu, to drown girls, was widespread because of mass famines. Basically, think of it like this. When times were tough, usually families had to make the horrible choice of killing their baby daughters. Exposure to the elements, strangulation, tossing a child into a basket, and casting it off were all normalized. Buddhists would build these things called baby towers for people to dump children at. Later on in 1930, Duxiu, a famous member of the May 4th movement, would write a story titled A Slave Mother, portraying how extreme poverty in rural communities led to female infanticide. Hell, turn the clock even more into the future, to the 1970s, and we get the one-child policy of the PRC, where females were often aborted or abandoned. It's actually an extremely relevant topic for today, as China is facing this extreme situation where they have something like, I believe, 30 million men more than women in their population. Without the ability for so many men to find wives, you can imagine this is going to lead to some very detrimental effects on society. For those of you who listen to politically motivated podcasts today, you might have noticed a lot of talk about illegal immigration in the United States and that a lot of them seem to be Chinese at the moment. These things could be interconnected. Back to the story, alongside the infanticide, girls at the age of 5 or 6 would often have their feet bound, a centuries-old practice that would increase their marriageability. This hobbled them for life, as you can imagine. When women married, their families pretty much abandoned them. More often than not, these marriages were arranged, and the new wife could expect to be at the autocratic mercy of her mother-in-law henceforth. If her husband died, there was a great social pressure for her to remain unmarried and chaste for the rest of her life. It goes without saying, suicide rates in China were the highest amongst young women. During the late 19th century, the ideal woman was 相妻, 良母, a good wife and loving mother. During the 20th century, the new ideal was becoming 矛盾婦女, modern women. By the way, for all of my audience members who do speak Chinese, I do apologize for my poor pronunciation. I am currently using Duolingo to try and learn Chinese a bit, so I'm trying. I speak English, French, and quite a bit of German, but Mandarin is very difficult. I have to admit, it's quite difficult. Women wanted to pursue education and careers outside the home. Whether it was by choice or for financial necessity, Chinese women increasingly left the domestic sphere. They entered the workforce in all available forms, typically but not limited to factories, offices, and the entertainment industry. Yet the traditional social norms limited their opportunities in work, education, and politics. Women, according to the traditional system, were not supposed to make speeches in the streets. But those like Liang Qiqiao began calling for the liberation of women, to let them be educated, to allow them to participate in Chinese society. The Confucian social order held the hierarchy of husband over wife, but within the new culture movement that criticized Confucianism and traditions, now there was a deep want for women to be seen as human beings, as independent people who should become actors in the public sphere. When those like Chen Duxiu began writing and lecturing about tossing aside the old and looking at the new, this also included women. Thus, the new culture movement had a large aspect of gender equality and female emancipation. There was also the aspect of dress. By the 1920s, women would abandon the traditional garments of embroidered hip or knee-length jackets and trousers. They began wearing short jackets, skirts, and the qipao, a one-piece dress. Unlike the traditional women's clothing that hung loosely around the body, the qipao was form-fitting. A women's suffrage movement began, though it would take some time. So you might be seeing something of a theme here. The old, traditional Confucian past was needing a new replacement. The written language needed to be updated. Women needed to be more equal to men. But how about the nation of China itself? The new cultural leaders wanted to see China as a nation amongst nations, not one culturally unique. They began doing what many nations did around the turn of the century. They looked outwards. They looked at the foreign doctrines, particularly those that emphasized cultural criticism and were nation-building. Many of these intellectuals were the lucky few who went abroad, receiving foreign education. They took Western and Japanese ideas, seeing what could be used to create a new model for China and her vast population. Countless were enthralled by President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and ideals of self-determination. The Xinhai Revolution had ushered in a Chinese nationalist spirit which demanded resistance to foreign impositions and the elimination of domestic autocracy. They had overthrown the Manchu. Now they wanted to overthrow the global powers who had been encroaching upon their nation since the mid-19th century. So many of these intellectuals hoped with the end of World War I would also come an end to their national disgrace. The intellectuals argued China's failure to modernize was caused both by external and internal factors. Externally, foreign powers had been encroaching upon China for many decades. Foreign powers had gone to war and defeated China, forcing her to sign unequal treaties. Internally, China's economy, social system, and cultural values were holding her back. This brought forward the need for a new culture to kickstart the development of a new state. They argued China needed educational and social progress to remedy the state's diplomatic weakness and endemic poverty. China's economy, social fabric, and international standing needed to be improved, and the answer was programs of public education. Yet to do so, the less educated needed to be able to read and participate, i.e., vernacular writing. Liang Qiqiao was a huge influence on ideas to build China as a modern state. He created the Ximin Tongbao, New Citizen, a biweekly journal first published in Yokohama, Japan, back in 1902. The journal covered numerous topics like politics, religion, law, economics, geography, current affairs, and such. Basically, Liang Qiqiao was showcasing to the Chinese public theories they had never seen before. Liang Qiqiao got Chinese people to think about the future of China. What did it even mean to identify as being Chinese? He allowed more Chinese to look out into the world, so they could see many different paths and ideas. At this time, there were countless. You had Darwinism, liberalism, pragmatism, socialism. All of these new isms could be used as tools to be a realization of a strong and unified China. And of course, there was Marxism. Many Chinese laborers who went to Russia saw firsthand what the Bolsheviks had accomplished. The principal of Peking University, Tai Yuanpei, would resign on May the 9th of 1919, causing a huge uproar. What once united all these intellectual new culture movement types gradually changed after the May 4th movement. He Shihe, Tai Yuanpei, and liberal-minded intellectuals urged for protesting students to return to their classrooms. But those like Chen Duxiu and Li Dajiao urged for more radical political action. Marxist study groups would form, and with them the first meetings of the Chinese Communist Party. This, of course, is a story for a future podcast, but it should be noted there would be a great divide amongst these intellectuals as to how China should be more modern. Li Dajiao, for example, advocated for fundamental solutions, while He Shihe criticized such thinking as calling for the study of questions, less study of isms. Those like Chen Duxiu and Li Dajiao would quickly find followers like Mao Zedong. Now, the overall theme here has been toss out Confucius, but it's not all like that. Part of the movement, much like the Meiji Restoration, was to usher in some new, but to also incorporate the old, to just not lose one's entire culture. For those of you who don't know, I began my time on YouTube specifically talking about the history of Tokugawa to Showa-era Japan. The Meiji Restoration was an incredible, all-encompassing hyper-modernization that, for the life of me, I can't find a comparison to. But an interesting aspect of it was fuko, to restore antiquity. It often goes unmentioned, but the Japanese made these enormous efforts to crop out the outside influences such as Confucianism, Buddhism, and such, to find the ancient cultures of their own people. This eventually led to an evolution of Shintoism. Thus, Japan not only wanted to adopt new ideas from the rest of the world, they also wanted to find important aspects of their own cultural history and retain it, make sure they did not lose what made them Japanese. The same can be said of China here. Yiku Pai, or the Doubting Antiquity School, was a group of scholars who applied a critical historiographical approach to Chinese historical sources. They took their ancient texts and really analyzed them to see what was truly authentic, what should be kept. Hu Shihe initiated the movement. He had studied abroad, and he was deeply influenced by Western thinking and argued at Peking University that all Chinese written history prior to the Eastern Zhou, that is the second half of the Zhou dynasty, needed to be carefully dissected. Many were concerned with the authenticity of pre-Qin texts and began questioning the writers of past dynasties. There was also Guo Jiegang, who formed the Guo debates on ancient history. It was a movement that had a published magazine of the same name. Later in 1922, there was a critical review journal involving numerous historians. Their work dismantled many beliefs, or, at minimum, cast some doubt on ancient textual writings that had been around for millennia. For example, there was the belief Yu the Great, or Yu the Engineer, who was the first to make real flood control efforts during the Xia dynasty, was an animal or a deity figure. There was the notion of peaceful transition of power, seen from the Yao to Shun dynasties, but the group found evidence this was all kind of concocted by philosophers of the Zhou dynasty, simply to support their political philosophy. They were basically detectives finding the bullshit in their ancient history, and this had a profound effect on the current-day thinking. The Doubting Antiquity group's efforts proved the history of China had been created iteratively. Ancient texts had been repeatedly edited, reorganized. Hell, many had fabricated things to make ends meet for themselves. You could not take them at their word or face value. They argued all the supernatural attributes of historical figures had to be questioned. A lot of it was simply not possible, and thus not authentic versions of their history. But the group also were victims of their own criticisms. Many of them would criticize parts of antiquity history simply to get rid of things they didn't like. They got in the way of current-day issues. It's rather ironic if you think about it. There was also another element to the Doubting Antiquity movement. Students were pushed to look over things in ancient Chinese history, Chinese folklore, that Confucian schools simply dismissed or ignored. Now, within the backdrop of the 21 demands, the Sino-Japanese Treaty, the double promising on behalf of Britain, and other secret deals made over the future of China, well, this all angered her people greatly. The common people of China did not feel represented nor heard at all. Japan was encroaching upon them in Manchuria and now Shandong. Their leadership were either making secret deals to secure their own objectives, or they were completely powerless to other nations and crumbling, such as the case with Versailles. With so many students and laborers going abroad witnessing the civilizations of other nations in the West and Japan, they yearned for new things those people had. Democratic and egalitarian values were at the very forefront of the new culture movement. Western science, democracy, bills of rights, racial equality, equality of opportunity, opportunity to venture into politics, the list can go on. These were the things alien to China. The people began to enchant the masses with such ideas, while simultaneously criticizing traditional Chinese ethics, her customs, literature, history, philosophy, religion, social and political institutions, and such. Liberalism, pragmatism, utilitarianism, anarchism, socialism, and communism were thrown around like yardsticks so the people could measure China's traditional culture against them. How did such isms match up? Within the current crisis in China, which one of these isms might benefit them the most? Overall, the movement kept up the greatest theme of needing to look forward. China had always looked to the past. They had suffered so immensely. They, after all, were enduring the century of humiliation, as it would famously become known. It was humiliation after humiliation. How could they change so the past would stop haunting them? Things like the Boxer Protocol. How could they rid China of such humiliating indemnity payments? Britain's opium had ushered in poison that still plagued them. How could they finally rid China of it? The war and encroachment of nations like Britain, Russia, and Japan. How could they stop them from continuing these actions? China could not stay the way she was anymore. She had to change. Thus, overall, within every facet of the movement's ideology, they kept emphasizing to stop looking in the past for answers for today. Today would require looking abroad and within, and it would not be easy. Again, like I said at the very beginning of this episode, I do apologize if it hasn't been too coherent. It is difficult to encompass a lot of the thoughts and feelings of this time. But it is part of a great event known as the May 4th movement of 1919. China is basically for the first time really going to try and adopt fundamental changes to become a real modern state. If it were not for, let's say, the descent into warlordism, perhaps the Chinese Republic dream could have been started in 1919. Regardless, China will see an incredible amount of change in a very short amount of time. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube. Over there, I just released part 3 on my series on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, Operation Jinzhou. And I must say, unlike pretty much anybody else on YouTube that I can see, I think I'm the only person who actually really looked in depth into the invasion of Manchuria. Most people just summarize it in a single paragraph. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you can find exclusive podcasts. In the past month, I've actually had a lot of people join up, so a big thanks to all of you. And a poll is up for what will be the next exclusive podcast. The choices I put up, although anybody can put up their own ideas, are the story of Operation Fugu, the idea to create an Israel in Shanghai, the wacky story of the Battle of Castle Itter, how the century of humiliation shaped the current People's Republic of China we see today, and a rather interesting out-of-nowhere episode on Tolkien's endless war in a decaying world. So if you join up pretty soon, you can join that poll, or, wait till the next poll. The New Culture movement saw numerous intellectuals rise up and challenge the prevailing social and political order of their nation. They tried to give the public new answers to old questions, and above all else, some hope. Hope for a better tomorrow. It was to be an artist's journey, but students would be the vanguard into a new age for China.